On September 7th, 1191, Richard the Lionheart marched 7,000 exhausted Crusaders through a killing field of 25,000 Muslim cavalry, absorbed 6 hours of relentless arrow fire, and then unleashed a single cavalry charge so devastating it shattered Saladin's army and rewrote the rules of medieval warfare. By sunset, the most feared commander in the Islamic world was fleeing the battlefield. Think about those numbers. 7,000 against 25,000. Nearly a 4.1 disadvantage. Marching through open terrain while mounted archers circled like wolves. Yet by the end of this video, you'll understand how Richard pulled off one of history's most tactically brilliant victories. I'm about to reveal 3 things that will change how you see the Crusades forever. First, the revolutionary marching formation that turned certain death into invincibility. Second, the moment 2 Hospitaller knights disobeyed orders and accidentally triggered the perfect attack. And third, why Saladin's chroniclers admitted this defeat haunted Islam for generations. But here's what makes this truly unbelievable. How did Crusaders in full armor survive 6 hours of arrow fire in the desert heat? What signal did Richard use to coordinate a perfect cavalry charge across a 2-mile battlefront? Why did 25,000 warriors break and run from 7,000 exhausted men? And how did one afternoon destroy Saladin's reputation as an unbeatable general? To understand how Richard achieved the impossible at Arsuf, we need to go back to the moment when the Third Crusade hung by a thread and Europe's most dangerous king decided to gamble everything on a single march. Richard Plantagenet wasn't just a king. He was a tactical genius, a warrior who'd spent his entire life perfecting the art of killing. And by 1191, he had become the most feared man in Christendom. At 34 years old, he'd already crushed rebellions in Aquitaine, humiliated his own father in battle, and seized the English throne through a combination of military brilliance and ruthless political maneuvering. But Richard didn't want England. He wanted Jerusalem. And when Pope Gregory VIII called for a Third Crusade after Saladin captured the Holy City in 1187, Richard took the cross with an intensity that shocked even his enemies. This wasn't religious devotion. This was obsession. Richard saw the crusade as the ultimate test, a chance to prove he was the greatest military commander alive by defeating the man everyone said was unbeatable. Let that sink in for a second. Richard had been fighting wars since he was 16 years old. 18 years of continuous combat experience. He'd commanded armies in over 40 engagements across France, never losing a battle where he personally led troops. His reputation was so terrifying that when he marched on a rebel castle in Aquitaine in 1183, the garrison surrendered before he even deployed his siege equipment. Just the sight of his banners approaching was enough. But here's what made Richard genuinely dangerous. He studied warfare like a science. While other kings relied on raw courage and feudal levies, Richard analyzed tactics, logistics, and battlefield psychology. He read classical military texts, Caesar, Vegetius, Byzantine tactical manuals. He understood siege engineering, knew how to position archers for maximum effect, and could calculate supply requirements for armies of thousands marching through hostile territory. Richard didn't just fight. He calculated how to win before the battle even started. His physical capabilities matched his tactical mind. Contemporary chroniclers describe Richard as 6'4", a giant by medieval standards. He could wield a sword one-handed that most men needed 2 hands to lift. In one documented incident during a siege in France, Richard personally led an assault on a castle wall, climbed a scaling ladder under arrow fire, killed 3 defenders at the top with his bare hands, and held the breach alone until reinforcements arrived. He was wounded twice in that assault. He kept fighting for another 4 hours. Think about the psychological impact of facing a commander like that. A man who was physically dominant, tactically brilliant, and absolutely fearless. Richard's enemies weren't just fighting an army. They were fighting a force of nature who genuinely believed he was invincible, and had 18 years of victories to prove it. Here's where it gets insane. When Richard took the cross in 1187, he didn't just gather an army. He spent 2 years methodically preparing the most well-funded, well-equipped military expedition the medieval world had ever seen. He raised 60,000 pounds of silver, equivalent to roughly 3 times England's annual royal revenue. He assembled a fleet of 100 ships. He recruited 8,000 professional soldiers and knights. He stockpiled siege equipment, weapons, armor, and enough supplies to sustain a campaign for years. Other kings took the cross and marched east with whatever forces they could scrape together. Richard approached the crusade like an engineering project, every detail planned, every contingency calculated. He arrived in the Holy Land in June 1191 with the single most formidable military force Christian Europe could assemble, led by a commander who'd never been defeated. And now that force was about to face the man who destroyed Jerusalem, conquered the Holy Land, and hadn't lost a major battle in over a decade. Saladin had no idea what was coming. But he was about to find out that the legends about Richard the Lionheart weren't exaggerations. They were understatements. And the clash between these two military titans would produce one of the most tactically brilliant battles in medieval history. Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, Saladin, had done what Christian Europe thought impossible. On October 2nd, 1187, after 88 years of Crusader rule, he recaptured Jerusalem. The victory wasn't just military. It was symbolic devastation. Saladin had unified fractured Muslim kingdoms, built an empire stretching from Egypt to Syria, and commanded an army that had annihilated the Crusader forces at the Horns of Hattin in July 1187. At Hattin, Saladin had destroyed nearly 20,000 Crusaders, captured the True Cross, and executed Templar and Hospitaller prisoners personally. By 1191, Saladin controlled almost every major city in the Holy Land. His army wasn't just large. It was battle-hardened, tactically sophisticated, and led by commanders who'd been fighting Crusaders for decades. When Richard arrived in the Holy Land in June 1191, Saladin had every reason to believe this would be another European army marching to its death. The numbers from Saladin's 1187 campaign were staggering. In the 4 months following Hattin, Saladin captured 52 fortified cities and castles. 52. Acre fell after a brief siege. Jaffa surrendered without a fight. Ascalon's garrison abandoned the city when they saw Saladin's banners approaching. Entire regions of the Crusader kingdoms simply collapsed. By the time Jerusalem fell in October, Saladin controlled everything except the fortress city of Tyre and a handful of isolated castles that were strategically irrelevant. Here's what made this conquest truly terrifying for Christian Europe. The speed. Saladin didn't grind through a decade-long campaign. He shattered the Crusader states in less than 6 months. One catastrophic defeat at Hattin, followed by a systematic rolling up of every defensive position the Crusaders had built over 88 years. It was surgical. It was devastating. And it proved that the Crusader presence in the Holy Land had been living on borrowed time. But Saladin's military capability went far beyond simple conquest. His army was a sophisticated military machine built on combined arms tactics that European commanders barely understood. Mamluk heavy cavalry, slave soldiers purchased as boys, trained for a decade in horsemanship and combat, equipped with the finest armor and weapons money could buy. Turkish horse archers, light cavalry who could fire arrows with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop. then scatter before enemies could close to melee range. Nubian infantry, spearmen and archers from Sudan and Egypt, disciplined, experienced, capable of holding defensive positions against cavalry charges. Think about the tactical flexibility that gave Saladin. He could fight pitched battles with heavy cavalry. He could conduct rapid hit-and-run raids with horse archers. He could besiege fortresses with infantry and engineers. Most medieval commanders had one tactical approach: charge with heavy cavalry and hope for the best. Saladin had an entire menu of options, and he knew exactly when to deploy each one. His commanders were equally formidable. Muzaffar ad-Din Gokbori, who'd fought in a dozen campaigns. Badr al-Din Dildirim, who commanded the Mamluk cavalry at Hattin. Al-Adil, Saladin's brother and one of the finest strategic minds in the Islamic world. These weren't nobles who'd inherited their positions. They were professional soldiers who'd earned command through competence and battlefield success. By 1191, Saladin's military reputation was untouchable. He'd unified Muslim territories that had been fragmented for generations. He'd retaken Jerusalem from the Franks, the sacred city that Muslims had lost to the First Crusade in 1099. He'd destroyed the military orders, the warrior monks who'd terrified Muslim armies for decades. Pope Urban III literally died of shock when he received news of Jerusalem's fall. That's how devastating Saladin's victory was. And now this unstoppable commander, with his battle-hardened army and his tactical brilliance, was about to face a European king who'd spent 2 years preparing for this exact confrontation. Saladin assumed Richard would be like the others. Brave, reckless, tactically predictable. Heavy cavalry charging at problems until they broke. He'd beaten that approach 100 times. What Saladin didn't know was that Richard had studied every battle Saladin had ever fought. He'd analyzed Hattin. He understood exactly how Saladin's cavalry tactics worked. And he devised a counter-strategy that would turn Saladin's greatest strengths into fatal weaknesses. The collision was inevitable. And when these two military geniuses finally met on the battlefield at Arsuf, one of them would learn that reputation means nothing against superior tactics. By late August 1191, Richard faced a brutal strategic reality. He'd captured the fortress city of Acre after a 2-month siege. But the victory had cost him thousands of men to disease, combat, and exhaustion. Jerusalem lay 60 miles inland, but Richard couldn't march directly on it. His supply lines would be cut. His army would be surrounded. He needed a secure coastal base further south. That meant taking Jaffa, a fortified port 60 miles down the coast. But the route from Acre to Jaffa was a nightmare. Open terrain, no natural defensive positions. Perfect ground for Saladin's cavalry to operate. Richard would have to march his entire army, infantry, cavalry, siege equipment, supply wagons, through hostile territory, while Saladin's forces harassed them from every direction. Military advisors told Richard it was suicide. March the army into open country and Saladin would destroy it piecemeal. But Richard had studied Saladin's tactics. He understood how Muslim cavalry operated, and he had a plan that would turn Saladin's greatest strength into a fatal weakness. The strategic math was brutal. Jerusalem sat inland, surrounded by hills and fortress positions Saladin controlled completely. Any army marching on the Holy City would have to cross 60 miles of hostile territory with supply lines stretching back to the coast. Saladin could cut those lines anywhere. Surround the Crusader army, starve it out, force it to either retreat or fight a defensive battle on ground of Saladin's choosing. Every military advisor in Richard's command understood this. You don't march an army deep into enemy territory without secure supply routes. That's how armies die. But here's what made the situation genuinely impossible. Richard's army wasn't just soldiers. He had siege equipment, catapults, trebuchets, battering rams, massive wooden structures that required wagons pulled by teams of oxen to transport. He had supply trains carrying food, water, weapons, armor, medical supplies for thousands of men. He had camp followers, servants, support personnel. The baggage train alone stretched for miles. Moving this entire force 60 miles inland while Saladin's cavalry harassed them from every direction. It would be a slaughter. Think about how Muslim cavalry tactics worked in 1191. Light horse archers would circle at a distance, fire arrows, retreat before the enemy could respond. They'd attack supply wagons, kill oxen, burn equipment, force the Crusader infantry to break formation to chase them, then scatter and regroup. Death by 1,000 cuts. Saladin had perfected this approach over decades of warfare. He'd used it to devastating effect at Hattin, where Crusader forces had marched into open terrain and been systematically destroyed. Richard's advisors pointed to recent history. In 1177, a Crusader army had attempted a similar march. Saladin's cavalry had harassed them for days, picking off stragglers, destroying supplies, wearing down the formation until the Crusaders were exhausted and demoralized. They'd limped back to their starting position, having accomplished nothing. In 1183, another attempt. Same result. The coastal plain between Acre and Jaffa was a killing ground for armies stupid enough to try crossing it, while Saladin controlled the interior. Here's where Richard's tactical genius emerged. He understood something his advisors didn't. The march to Jaffa wasn't suicide, if he could solve one critical problem. How do you move a slow, vulnerable army through 60 miles of open terrain while enemy cavalry attacks from every direction? The answer wasn't to avoid the march. The answer was to turn the entire army into a moving fortress that could absorb punishment, protect its vulnerable elements, and strike back with devastating force at exactly the right moment. Richard gathered his senior commanders on August 20th, 1190. French nobles, English barons, Italian mercenary captains, Grand Masters of the Templars and Hospitallers. He laid out his plan. They would march in a formation no European army had ever attempted. Tight, disciplined, every man assigned a specific position. Infantry protecting cavalry, cavalry waiting for the perfect moment to unleash hell. The march would be slow, deliberate, and under his absolute control. Several commanders objected. This level of coordination required discipline medieval armies simply didn't possess. Knights didn't march in formation. They charged. That's what they were trained for. Asking them to endure hours of attacks without retaliating went against every instinct. Richard's response was simple. Anyone who breaks formation without my direct order will be executed. Anyone who charges prematurely will be stripped of rank and expelled from the army. We march as one, or we die as individuals. On August 22nd, 1191, the Crusader army left Acre and began the march toward Jaffa. 7,000 men walking into what everyone believed was certain death. What they were about to achieve would redefine medieval warfare and prove that discipline could defeat overwhelming numbers. But first, they'd have to survive. On August 22nd, 1191, Richard's army left Acre and began the march south. What happened next redefined defensive warfare. Richard organized his 7,000 men into a formation so tactically sophisticated that military historians still study it today. The army marched in a rectangular column parallel to the coast. On the seaward side, Richard's fleet sailed alongside, providing supplies, water, and an escape route if catastrophe struck. On the landward side, facing the interior where Saladin's forces waited, Richard deployed his infantry in multiple ranks. The outer rank consisted of infantry with large shields, creating a moving wall. Behind them, crossbowmen. Behind them, more infantry. And at the center of this moving fortress, protected by walls of men, rode Richard's heavy cavalry. His knights, the armored shock troops that represented the Crusaders' only offensive capability. Here's what made this formation genius. Richard understood that Saladin's cavalry relied on mobility and missile fire. Muslim mounted archers would circle, shoot, retreat, circle again. They couldn't break a tight infantry formation, and they couldn't force heavy cavalry to charge until Richard was ready. The formation turned the entire army into a single weapon, indestructible on defense, devastating when released. The specific composition of this formation was mathematical precision. The outer defensive line consisted of approximately 3,000 infantry armed with large kite shields and spears. These men marched shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, creating a continuous barrier roughly 2 miles long. Behind them, positioned in staggered ranks, 1,500 crossbowmen. Behind the crossbowmen, another 1,500 infantry with shorter spears and backup shields. And at the protected center, 1,200 mounted knights, the elite heavy cavalry that represented the Crusaders' striking power. Think about the spacing for a second. The entire formation was approximately 400 yards wide and 2 miles long. Every man had an assigned position. Infantry rotated in shifts. Front rank would march for 2 hours, then cycle to the rear to rest, while fresh troops moved forward. This meant the defensive wall facing Saladin's cavalry was constantly refreshed with soldiers who weren't exhausted. Medieval armies didn't operate this way. This was Roman legion-level coordination applied to 12th century warfare. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about why this formation was revolutionary. Traditional Crusader tactics relied on heavy cavalry charges. Knights would see enemy forces, charge immediately, and win through shock impact. It was brave. It was aggressive. And against Muslim cavalry, it was suicide. Horse archers would scatter, let the knights exhaust their horses chasing phantoms, then circle back and shoot the isolated, tired cavalry to pieces. Hatton had proven this. Dozens of smaller engagements had proven this. European heavy cavalry was devastating in close combat, but helpless against mobile archers who refused to engage directly. Richard flipped the script entirely. His formation made the cavalry untouchable. Muslim horse archers could fire at the infantry all day, but they couldn't reach the knights protected in the center. And the infantry, with their overlapping shields and multiple ranks, could absorb arrow fire almost indefinitely. Arrows would strike shields, stick into the wood, create a porcupine effect. But the formation held. Men would be wounded, yes. Some would die, but the structure remained intact. The psychological impact on Richard's men was equally calculated. Knights weren't passive by nature. Asking armored warriors to march slowly while infantry protected them violated every instinct. But Richard had drilled into them a simple truth. The moment you break formation, you die. The moment you charge without my order, you condemn your brothers to death. We move as one or we don't move at all. He'd spent weeks at Acre training this formation. Mock battles, drills, punishments for anyone who broke discipline. By the time the army marched south, every man understood his role. The infantry knew they were shields for the cavalry. The cavalry knew they were the hammer waiting to strike. And everyone knew that Richard controlled when that hammer would fall. The formation began moving south at dawn on August 22nd. Speed, approximately 2 miles per hour. Deliberate, grinding. The fleet sailed parallel, ships loaded with supplies, fresh water, medical equipment. If the land march failed catastrophically, The army could retreat to the ships and evacuate. It was a safety net, but Richard had no intention of using it. Saladin's scouts watched this formation assemble and reported back to their commander. A massive rectangular column, tight ranks, disciplined movement, naval support. Saladin had never seen anything like it. He'd faced Crusader armies before, disorganized mobs of brave but tactically incompetent knights. This was different. This was professional. But Saladin commanded 25,000 men. Richard had 7,000. The numbers still favored the Muslims overwhelmingly. And Saladin was confident that once his cavalry began their harassment, once the arrows started falling, the Crusader formation would crack like every other Christian army had cracked. He was about to discover he was wrong. And the education would cost him everything. The men on the outer ranks of Richard's formation knew they were walking targets. Light infantry, armed with spears and shields, marching under the desert sun while arrows fell like rain. These weren't knights. They were common soldiers, mercenaries, pilgrims who'd taken the cross for salvation or pay. They wore minimal armor, padded jackets, leather caps, maybe a mail shirt if they were lucky. An arrow could punch through that. A direct hit could kill. And they marched for 6 hours, knowing every step brought more arrows. Muslim chroniclers, writing after the battle, described the Crusader infantry with something close to awe. These men didn't break. They didn't run. Arrows stuck in their armor like porcupine quills. Some soldiers had 5, 6, 7 arrows embedded in their shields and jackets, still marching, still holding formation. One account describes an infantry soldier with an arrow through his face, the shaft protruding from both cheeks, who stayed in line until he collapsed from blood loss. This wasn't bravery. This was something beyond bravery. This was discipline forged through Richard's relentless training and the understanding that breaking formation meant death for everyone. Let that sink in for a second. These weren't professional soldiers in the modern sense. Most were farmers, craftsmen, laborers from England, France, Italy, Germany. Men who'd taken the cross for different reasons. Some for religious salvation, some for adventure. Some because their feudal lords commanded it. Some because military service paid better than starving in a village. The average Crusader infantryman earned about 4 pence per day. A knight earned 10 times that. These men were at the bottom of the military hierarchy, and they knew it. But here's what made them genuinely dangerous. Richard had trained them like no medieval army had been trained before. For weeks at Acre, he drilled these infantry units relentlessly. March in formation. Hold the line under simulated arrow fire. Rotate ranks without breaking cohesion. Ignore wounds. Ignore fear. Trust the man beside you because your life depends on his discipline and his depends on yours. Richard didn't ask for courage. He demanded obedience, and he'd made it clear. Breaking formation meant immediate execution, not later. Not after the battle, immediately. The physical toll these men absorbed defies belief. Contemporary accounts from both Crusader and Muslim sources describe infantry soldiers with multiple arrows embedded in their bodies, still standing, still marching. One chronicler, Baha ad-Din ibn Shaddad, Saladin's personal secretary, wrote, "The Frankish infantry were like a wall. Our arrows fell upon them like rain falls upon stone. They neither flinched nor faltered." Another account describes a soldier whose shield had accumulated so many arrows, 17 counted after the battle, that he could barely lift it. He marched for 3 more hours before collapsing from exhaustion. Think about what that means, physiologically. An arrow fired from a composite bow at 50 yards carries enough kinetic energy to penetrate padded armor and lodge in flesh. The pain is immediate and excruciating. Shock sets in. Blood loss begins. Most men would drop. These soldiers kept marching because they understood the alternative. If the formation broke, Muslim cavalry would surge through the gap. They'd massacre the knights in the center. They'd slaughter the baggage train. Everyone would die. So they marched, bleeding, wounded, arrows protruding from shoulders, thighs, backs, still moving. Here's where it gets genuinely insane. Richard had implemented a rotation system that kept the outer ranks from collapsing entirely. Every 2 hours, the frontline infantry would cycle to the rear, and fresh troops would move forward. This meant no single soldier had to endure the worst of the arrow fire for more than 2 hours at a time. It sounds simple, but coordinating this rotation while maintaining formation, while under active attack, while marching through heat and dust, that required discipline medieval armies simply didn't possess. Muslim cavalry commanders noticed. Taqi ad-Din, Saladin's nephew and one of his best tactical minds, reportedly told Saladin, "These are not the Franks we fought at Hattin. These men are different. They die, but they don't break." The infantry knew what they represented. They were the shield that protected the hammer. Their suffering bought time for Richard's cavalry to wait for the perfect moment. Their discipline was the foundation of the entire tactical plan. If they broke, the plan failed. So they didn't break. They absorbed punishment that should have shattered any army and kept marching. But every formation has a breaking point. And Saladin was about to test whether Richard's human shield could survive the full weight of 25,000 warriors committed to total assault. For 2 weeks, Saladin had harassed Richard's march. His cavalry attacked the column daily, firing arrows, retreating, attacking again. It was exhausting, demoralizing warfare designed to break the Crusaders' will. But Richard's formation held. The army kept moving. By September 6th, Richard's forces were approaching Arsuf, a small town about 30 miles south of Acre. Saladin made a decision. No more harassment. Tomorrow, he would commit his entire army to a full-scale assault. This would be total war. Saladin assembled approximately 25,000 troops, the largest force he'd fielded since Hattin. Mamluk cavalry, Turkish horse archers, Bedouin light cavalry, Nubian infantry, his best units, his most experienced commanders. The plan was simple. Overwhelm Richard's formation through sheer numbers, force the Crusader cavalry to charge prematurely, separate them from their infantry, and destroy them. Saladin had seen it work before. Christian knights were brave but undisciplined. If he could provoke them into an early charge, he could annihilate Richard's army before nightfall. On the evening of September 6th, Saladin's forces camped in the hills east of Arsuf. Tomorrow, the army of Islam would finish what it started at Hattin. The numbers from those 2 weeks of harassment told a frustrating story. Saladin's cavalry had fired an estimated 200,000 arrows at Richard's column. 200,000. Muslim horse archers had attacked every single day, sometimes 3 or 4 separate assaults in a single afternoon. They'd killed perhaps 300 and 400 Crusader infantry. They'd wounded hundreds more. They'd slowed the march to a crawl. But they hadn't broken the formation. Not once. Not even close. Think about that from Saladin's perspective. He'd committed thousands of cavalry, his best horse archers, to daily attacks for 14 straight days. The Crusader column should have disintegrated. Men should have deserted. Knights should have charged prematurely and been destroyed. Instead, Richard's formation absorbed everything Saladin threw at it and kept moving south, 2 miles per day, methodical as a machine. It was unprecedented, and it was infuriating. Saladin understood what Richard was doing. The Crusader king was treating the march like a siege, defend until the perfect moment, then strike. But Saladin also understood that Richard's position was becoming increasingly vulnerable. The closer Richard got to Jaffa, the further he stretched from his base at Acre. The longer the march continued, the more exhausted his troops became. Saladin's cavalry rotated daily. Fresh squadrons would attack while exhausted units rested. Richard's infantry had no such luxury. They marched every day. They fought every day. They were reaching their breaking point. Here's where Saladin made his crucial calculation. On September 7th, Richard's column would pass through Arsuf. The terrain there was perfect for a decisive engagement. Open ground to the east, where Saladin could deploy his full army. The coast to the west, limiting Richard's maneuver options. Hills to the south, where Saladin could position reserves. If Saladin committed everything, all 25,000 troops attacking simultaneously, Richard would be forced to respond. The Crusader formation couldn't simply absorb that level of assault. The knights would have to charge, and when they did, Saladin would spring the trap. The force Saladin assembled that evening was staggering. The right wing, 7,000 Mamluk cavalry under the command of Muzaffar ad-Din Gokbori, heavy cavalry capable of shock combat. The left wing, 6,000 Turkish and Bedouin horse archers under Taqi ad-Din, Saladin's nephew and most aggressive commander. The center, Saladin personally commanding 8,000 mixed cavalry and 4,000 Nubian infantry. Reserve forces positioned in the hills. Another 1,000 cavalry, ready to exploit any breakthrough. Muslim commanders gathered around Saladin's tent that evening for final orders. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. The left wing under Taqi ad-Din would strike the Crusader rear guard, the Hospitallers, warrior monks known for their aggression and pride. Hit them hard. Provoke them. Make them angry enough to charge without orders. Once the Hospitallers broke formation and charged, Taqi ad-Din's light cavalry would scatter. The Hospitallers would pursue, separating themselves from the main Crusader column. Then, Saladin's reserves would sweep in from the flanks, surround the isolated Hospitallers, and massacre them. With the rear guard destroyed, the rest of Richard's column would be vulnerable to attack from behind. It was the same tactic that had worked at Hattin. Provoke the impulsive Christians into breaking formation. Separate their heavy cavalry from their infantry. Destroy them piecemeal. Saladin had executed this plan dozens of times against Crusader armies. There was no reason it wouldn't work again. But here's what Saladin didn't know. Richard had anticipated exactly this approach. He'd studied Hattin. He understood the trap, and he'd given specific orders to the Hospitallers. No matter what happens, no matter how much you're provoked, do not charge until I give the signal. Anyone who breaks this order answers to me personally. The stage was set. 25,000 Muslim warriors preparing to attack 7,000 exhausted Crusaders. Saladin confident in his numerical superiority and his tactical plan. Richard betting everything that his discipline would hold long enough to turn Saladin's aggression into a fatal mistake. September 7th, 1191, would determine which commander understood warfare better. And by sunset, one of them would be fleeing the battlefield, while the other wrote himself into legend. September 7th, 1191. Dawn broke over Arsuf with the metallic sound of 25,000 men preparing for war. Saladin's army assembled in the pre-dawn darkness, cavalry units forming into squadrons, archers checking bowstrings, infantry sharpening blades. The Muslim forces deployed across a 2-mile front east of the coastal road, positioned on slightly elevated ground that gave them a clear view of Richard's approaching column. Saladin divided his army into tactical wings. On the right, Mamluk heavy cavalry, elite slave soldiers trained from childhood in warfare, armored, disciplined, deadly. On the left, Turkish horse archers and Bedouin light cavalry. mobile skirmishers who could fire arrows at full gallop and vanish before retaliation. In the center, Saladin commanded personally, surrounded by his bodyguard and the yellow banners of the Ayyubid dynasty. Behind the cavalry, Nubian and Egyptian infantry waited with spears and shields. And everywhere, drummers. Muslim armies used drums to coordinate attacks, to intimidate enemies, to create psychological pressure. As the sun rose, the drums began, a rhythmic pounding that could be heard for miles. Richard's scouts reported back. Saladin's entire army was assembled and waiting. The visual scale of Saladin's deployment was overwhelming. 25,000 mounted and foot soldiers stretched across the coastal plain in organized formations that demonstrated decades of military sophistication. Each cavalry squadron numbered approximately 500 riders, 50 squadrons total. The standards and banners of different emirs, different tribes, different regions of Saladin's empire created a forest of colored silk rippling in the morning breeze. Yellow for the Ayyubids, green for units from Damascus, red for Egyptian Mamluks, black for Bedouin contingents. The sheer diversity of the force represented the extent of Saladin's power. Warriors from Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia, Arabia, all unified under his command. Think about the sound for a second. 25,000 men and their horses don't assemble quietly. The jingle of armor and harnesses, the snorting and stamping of thousands of war horses, the shouts of commanders positioning their units, and over it all, the drums. Islamic military doctrine used percussion instruments not just for signaling but for psychological impact. The deep, rhythmic pounding created a sense of inevitability. It told the enemy, "We are many, we are organized, we are coming." Here's what made this deployment genuinely terrifying from a tactical perspective. Saladin had positioned his force on elevated ground approximately 800 yards from the coastal road where Richard's column would pass. That distance was perfect, close enough to launch cavalry charges that would hit Richard's formation before the Crusaders could fully react. Far enough to stay outside the effective range of Crusader crossbows. Saladin controlled the high ground. He had numerical superiority of nearly 4-1, and he'd chosen terrain that maximized his cavalry's mobility while constraining Richard's options. Saladin himself rode among his commanders that morning, offering final instructions. Contemporary Muslim chroniclers describe him as calm, confident, even relaxed. Why wouldn't he be? The numbers favored him overwhelmingly. His tactical plan was sound. His troops were experienced, well-equipped, and motivated. This wasn't some desperate gamble. This was the Islamic world's premier military commander, deploying superior forces against an exhausted enemy who'd been marching for 2 weeks straight. The specific unit deployments reveal Saladin's tactical sophistication. He'd placed his most aggressive commander, Taqi ad-Din, in charge of the left wing with explicit orders to target the Crusader rear guard. Taqi ad-Din commanded 6,000 light cavalry, the fastest, most mobile units in Saladin's army. Their job was to strike hard, provoke a response, and draw the Crusader cavalry out of formation. The right wing under Gokbori would pressure the Crusader vanguard, preventing them from rotating to help the rear. And Saladin's center would be positioned to exploit any breakthrough, any moment of confusion, any gap in Richard's formation. But here's what Saladin didn't account for. Richard had scouts everywhere, light cavalry patrols, infantry, observers positioned in the coastal hills, sailors on ships parallel to the march who could see the entire battlefield from offshore. By 6 a.m., Richard knew exactly where Saladin was positioned. He knew the approximate size of the Muslim force. He knew which units were deployed where, and he understood immediately what Saladin intended. Richard called his senior commanders together just after dawn. Templars, Hospitallers, French nobles, English barons. He pointed east toward the assembled Muslim army and said something that contemporary chronicles recorded almost verbatim. Today, they'll try to break us. They'll attack the rear, try to make us panic, try to force us to charge. Anyone who breaks formation dies by my hand before the Muslims get a chance. We march. We hold. And when I give the signal, only when I give the signal, we show them what discipline looks like. 25,000 warriors waited to kill 7,000 men. The largest pitched battle of the Third Crusade was about to begin, and neither commander knew that the next 6 hours would redefine medieval warfare forever. Richard's column resumed its march at dawn, knowing what was coming. 7,000 men walking into a battle they couldn't avoid. The formation held its rectangular shape. Infantry on the flanks. Cavalry protected in the center, the fleet sailing parallel along the coast. Richard divided his cavalry into 5 squadrons, each assigned to a different section of the column. The Templars held the vanguard. The Hospitallers held the rear guard, the most dangerous position because Saladin always attacked from behind to slow and disrupt marching armies. Richard commanded the center with the main Crusader cavalry. The pace was deliberate. Not a retreat, not a charge, just a steady, grinding march through heat and dust. Around 9 a.m., Saladin gave the order to attack. The Muslim cavalry surged forward. Not a single mass charge, but waves of mounted archers, each wave riding to within 50 yards of the Crusader column, unleashing volleys of arrows, then wheeling away. The arrows came in clouds, thousands of arrows every minute. The sound was a constant hissing like heavy rain on stone. Arrows struck shields, armor, exposed flesh. Men fell, horses screamed and collapsed. And Richard's army kept marching. The first wave hit at 9:07 a.m. Approximately 2,000 Turkish horse archers swept in from the east, moving at full gallop. They approached to within 50 yards, close enough for their composite bows to punch through light armor, far enough to avoid Crusader crossbow fire. Each archer carried a quiver of 40-50 arrows. Simple math. 2,000 archers, 40 arrows each. That's 80,000 arrows in the first assault alone. They fired in controlled volleys. A hissing wave of death launched every 15 seconds. 3 volleys. 4, 5. Then they wheeled their horses away, and a second wave immediately replaced them. Think about what that looked like from the Crusader perspective. You're an infantry, soldier on the outer rank, shields locked with the men beside you. Suddenly the air darkens, not metaphorically, literally darkens as thousands of arrows arc overhead. The sound is unlike anything in nature. A high-pitched whistling that turns into impacts. Thunk, 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 thunk. Arrows hitting shields, arrows punching through leather armor, arrows finding gaps between overlapping shields. Men grunt, men scream, men fall. And the standing orders are clear. Do not break formation. Do not retaliate. Keep marching. The Crusader crossbowmen, positioned behind the shield wall, had explicit instructions from Richard. Only fire if Muslim cavalry comes within 30 yards. Conserve ammunition. Make every shot count. So they stood there, watching arrows fall on their comrades, unable to respond because the Muslim horse archers stayed just outside effective range. It was psychologically devastating. Warriors trained to fight back, forced to absorb punishment passively. Here's where Saladin's tactical approach became clear. He wasn't trying to break the Crusader formation with the first assault. He was testing it, probing for weaknesses, looking for any gap, any moment of confusion, any unit that might panic and run. His cavalry commanders had orders to rotate attacks continuously. First wave fires and retreats. Second wave attacks while the first reloads. Third wave follows. Continuous pressure. No pause, no respite. By 9:30 a.m., the pattern was established. Muslim cavalry would charge in from the east, fire volleys at close range, wheel away. Crusader infantry would absorb the arrows, maintain formation, keep marching. Casualties mounted steadily. Contemporary estimates suggest the Crusaders were losing 10 to 15 men every 10 minutes. Wounded soldiers would stumble out of formation, collapse, and be left behind as the column continued. There was no time for medical treatment. No way to evacuate the wounded except onto the ships sailing parallel to the coast. And reaching the ships meant breaking formation. Saladin watched from his command position on the elevated ground. He'd expected the Crusader formation to crack by now. Christian knights didn't have the discipline for this kind of warfare. They charged. That's what they did. Absorbing punishment without retaliating violated every instinct. Yet Richard's column kept moving. Slow, methodical, bleeding from 1,000 wounds, but structurally intact. At 10 a.m., Saladin escalated. He committed more cavalry to the assault. 4,000 horse archers now attacking in continuous rotation. The volume of arrows increased exponentially. Muslim chroniclers later described the Crusader column as resembling a hedgehog. So many arrows protruding from shields and armor that individual soldiers looked like they were covered in quills. And still the formation held. Richard rode up and down the column, visible to his men, shouting encouragement and threats in equal measure. "Hold the line. Anyone who breaks formation dies by my hand." His presence had an almost supernatural effect. Soldiers who'd been on the verge of panic saw their king under the same arrow fire they were enduring, completely calm, and they steadied. But Saladin had one more card to play. He hadn't committed his most aggressive commander yet. Taqi ad-Din and his 6,000 cavalry on the left wing were waiting for the order to attack the Crusader rear guard. The Hospitallers, the warrior monks who'd never retreated from a fight in their history. When that assault came, the real battle would begin. And Saladin was betting everything that the Hospitallers' pride would finally break Richard's perfect discipline. What happened over the next 6 hours should have broken the Crusader army. Muslim cavalry attacked in relays. As one squadron exhausted its arrows and pulled back, another charged forward. The assault was constant. There was no pause, no respite. Crusader infantry on the flanks absorbed the worst of it. Arrows struck them from every angle. Men marched with shafts protruding from their shoulders, their legs, their shields, their armor. Some infantry carried so many arrows embedded in their equipment they looked like walking hedgehogs. And they kept marching. Here's where Richard's genius became clear. He'd given strict orders. No breaking formation, no retaliation, no cavalry charges until he gave the signal. Every knight in that column wanted to charge. That's what knights did. You didn't absorb punishment. You attacked. You destroyed your enemies in close combat. But Richard knew that's exactly what Saladin wanted. If the Crusader cavalry charged prematurely, they'd be separated from their infantry. Muslim horse archers would scatter, regroup, and surround the isolated knights. It had happened at Hattin. It wouldn't happen here. But holding men back under 6 hours of arrow fire? That required discipline beyond anything medieval armies typically possessed. Between 9 a.m. and 3 p.m., 6 full hours, Saladin's cavalry launched approximately 40 separate assault waves. 40. Each wave consisted of 1,000 to 2,000 horse archers attacking in coordinated volleys. Conservative estimates place the total number of arrows fired at the Crusader column during this period at over 300,000. 300,000 arrows. Let that sink in for a second. That's roughly 50,000 arrows per hour. 833 arrows per minute. Almost 14 arrows hitting the Crusader formation every single second for 6 straight hours. The cumulative casualties were devastating. By noon, Richard's army had lost approximately 400 infantry killed outright. Another 600 were wounded badly enough that they could barely maintain formation. Horses were dying constantly, approximately 200 war horses killed by arrow fire, forcing knights to dismount and continue on foot. The Crusader column was bleeding to death slowly, methodically, while Saladin's cavalry suffered almost no losses because they never closed to melee range. Here's what made this torture genuinely unbearable for the Crusader cavalry. Knights were trained from childhood for one purpose: close combat, charge the enemy, break them with shock impact, win through superior armor and weapons. Sitting in the center of the formation, watching infantry die to protect them, listening to the constant hiss of arrows, the screams of wounded men, the crash of collapsing horses. It violated every instinct they possessed. These were warrior aristocrats who'd built their entire identities around martial prowess and aggressive courage. Richard was asking them to be passive, to endure, to wait. Several knights reportedly begged Richard for permission to charge. French nobles in particular argued that the formation was suicide. "Let us attack. We're being slaughtered like sheep." Richard's response, recorded by chroniclers, was ice cold. "Any man who charges without my order will be hanged. We wait. We endure. And when the moment comes, we strike so hard they'll remember it for 1,000 years." Think about the psychological pressure that created. Knights watching their infantry shield bearers absorb arrows meant for them, knowing that their survival depended on common soldiers, men they normally considered beneath their social class, dying to protect them. Some knights wept from frustration and shame. Others shouted obscenities at the Muslim cavalry, daring them to come closer. But they held formation because Richard had made the alternative clear. Break discipline. Die by hanging before the Muslims get a chance to kill you. The rotation system Richard had implemented began to break down around 1 p.m. The plan was to cycle fresh infantry to the front ranks every 2 hours. But casualties were so heavy that there weren't enough uninjured men left to maintain the rotation. Wounded soldiers stayed in formation because pulling them out would create gaps. Men with arrows embedded in their shoulders, their thighs, their backs kept marching because the alternative was formation collapse and total annihilation. By 2 p.m., Saladin committed his left wing under Taqi ad-Din to a massive assault on the Crusader rear guard. 6,000 cavalry, the largest concentration of Muslim forces deployed in a single attack, charged directly at the Hospitallers. The warrior monks, already under sustained arrow fire for 5 hours, suddenly faced a wall of screaming cavalry bearing down on them. Arrows fell like rain. Muslim cavalry circled and harassed. The sound was overwhelming: drums, war cries, the thunder of thousands of hooves, the screaming of dying horses and men. The Hospitallers held their ground, but their horses were dying. Their infantry support was being decimated, and their Grand Master, Garnier de Nablus, watched his knights, men who'd taken vows to defend Christendom, being slaughtered while under orders not to fight back. At 2:30 p.m., Garnier rode forward through the formation, found Richard, and demanded permission to charge. "My lord, we are being destroyed. Give us the order." Richard looked at the Hospitaller Grand Master and said one word: "No." Garnier returned to his position. The arrows kept falling. The cavalry kept circling. And somewhere in the Hospitaller ranks, 2 knights, exhausted, wounded, watching their brothers die, made a decision that would change the course of the battle and medieval warfare itself. They couldn't take it anymore. They were about to break every order Richard had given. And accidentally, they were about to trigger the perfect moment for Richard's counterattack. By 3 p.m., the Hospitallers at the rear guard had reached their limit. These weren't ordinary soldiers. Hospitallers were warrior monks, elite heavy cavalry, men who'd taken vows to fight and die for Christ. They'd absorbed hours of attacks. Their horses were wounded and dying. Their brothers were falling, and they were still under orders not to charge. The Hospitaller Marshal, Garnier de Nablus, rode to Richard personally. "My lord, we're being destroyed. Give us permission to charge." Richard refused. Not yet. The timing wasn't right. Garnier rode back to his men, and the arrows kept coming. Then, at approximately 3:15 p.m., 2 Hospitaller knights, their names lost to history, made a decision that should have destroyed Richard's entire plan. They couldn't take it anymore. They spurred their horses forward. They charged. In any other medieval army, this would have been disaster. 2 knights breaking formation, charging into 25,000 enemies. But here's what those 2 knights didn't know. Their timing was accidentally perfect. The Hospitallers' position by 3 p.m. was catastrophic. Of the original 200 Hospitaller knights assigned to the rear guard, approximately 40 were dead. Another 60 were wounded, some with multiple arrows embedded in their armor and flesh, still fighting because there was nowhere to go. Their horses had taken even worse casualties. Approximately 80 war horses had been killed or wounded so badly they couldn't continue. Knights whose mounts had been shot out from under them were fighting on foot, which for heavy cavalry was a death sentence in prolonged combat. Think about what that meant tactically. The Hospitallers were warrior monks who dedicated their entire lives to defending Christian pilgrims and fighting Islam's armies. They'd survived sieges, ambushes, pitched battles across the Holy Land. They were the absolute elite of Crusader military forces. And for 6 hours, they'd been ordered to stand and die without fighting back. Their training, their vows, their entire purpose was to attack the enemies of Christ. Richard was asking them to be shields. Passive, defensive. It was psychological torture. Taqi ad-Din, commanding Saladin's left wing, had recognized the Hospitallers as the weak point. He'd concentrated his 6,000 cavalry specifically on the rear guard, attacking in waves, trying to provoke exactly this response. Muslim cavalry would charge to within 30 yards, fire volleys, shout insults, wave-captured Christian banners, anything to enrage the Hospitallers into breaking formation. Between 2 p.m. and 3 p.m. alone, Taqi ad-Din's forces had launched 12 separate assault waves at the Hospitaller position. 12 waves in 1 hour. The pressure was relentless. Garnier de Nablus had held his men together through sheer force of will. When knights screamed for permission to charge, he'd refused. When wounded men begged to be allowed to strike back before they died, he'd ordered them to hold. He'd ridden to Richard twice asking for permission to counterattack. Both times Richard had said no. Wait, endure, trust me. But at 3:15 p.m., 2 Hospitaller knights, contemporary chronicles don't record their names, which suggests they were relatively junior knights rather than noble commanders, reached their breaking point simultaneously. One knight's horse had just been hit by 3 arrows in rapid succession. The animal screamed, stumbled, and collapsed. The knight rolled clear, landed on his feet, and saw another arrow punch through the throat of a brother knight standing beside him. Something snapped. He grabbed the reins of a wounded but still mobile horse, mounted, and spurred forward. The second knight saw the first charge and made an instant decision. His brother wasn't dying alone. He charged too. 2 knights, 2 horses, charging into 6,000 Muslim cavalry. here's where it gets insane. In any rational scenario, those two knights would be isolated, surrounded, and killed within seconds. Taqi ad-Din's cavalry would scatter, let them exhaust themselves, then swarm them. Their deaths would accomplish nothing except to demonstrate why breaking formation was suicide. But three things happened that the two charging knights couldn't have known. First, Richard had been watching the battle unfold from his position in the center of the column. He'd been tracking Saladin's cavalry deployments, noting when fresh squadrons rotated in, when exhausted units pulled back. By 3:15 p.m., he'd observed that the majority of Saladin's horse archers had committed fully to the assault. They'd closed to within 40 to 50 yards of the Crusader formation, closer than they'd been all day. They were focused on maintaining pressure, firing arrows, circling. They weren't positioned for rapid retreat. Second, Saladin's cavalry, after 6 hours of attacking without serious opposition, had grown confident. Muslim horse archers had been operating with impunity all day. They'd fired hundreds of thousands of arrows, inflicted massive casualties, and the Crusaders hadn't counterattacked once. Taqi ad-Din's commanders assumed the Crusader formation was on the verge of collapse. The sudden sight of two knights charging didn't trigger immediate alarm. It looked like desperation, not strategy. Third, Richard saw the two Hospitallers charge. In that split second, he made a calculation that would decide the battle. He could try to recall them, which would fail, and leave them isolated. Or he could recognize that after 6 hours of absorbing punishment, after Saladin's cavalry had committed fully to close-range assault, after Muslim forces had clustered tight around the Crusader formation, the perfect moment for a counterattack had arrived. Richard raised his arm. Trumpets blared across the entire 2-mile column. The signal every Crusader knight had been waiting 6 hours to hear. The signal that meant one thing: charge. What happened in the next 60 seconds would shatter Saladin's army and change the course of the Third Crusade. But first, what in 200 armored knights who'd been forced to watch their comrades die for 6 hours were about to be unleashed with 6 hours of accumulated rage? Saladin's cavalry had no idea what was coming. But they were about to find out why you never, ever let Richard the Lionheart choose the moment to strike. Richard saw the Hospitallers charge. In that split second, he had a choice. Try to recall them and restore order, which would fail and leave them isolated, or commit everything. Richard had been waiting for the right moment. The moment when Saladin's cavalry had committed fully to the attack, when they were close enough that a Crusader charge would hit before they could scatter. That moment had arrived. Richard gave the signal. Trumpets blared across the 2-mile column. Every Crusader cavalryman heard it. The sound meant one thing: charge. What happened next was one of the most devastating cavalry assaults in medieval history. 5 squadrons of heavy cavalry, approximately 1,200 armored knights, burst from the center of the column simultaneously. These weren't random charges. Each squadron targeted a specific section of Saladin's line. The coordination was perfect. After hours of discipline, after 6 hours of holding formation while arrows fell, the Crusader cavalry exploded forward with accumulated fury. Horses that had been walking for hours suddenly galloped. Knights who'd been passive targets became armored battering rams. And Saladin's cavalry, which had been circling and shooting, suddenly found itself facing the one thing Muslim horse archers couldn't stop: a massed charge of heavy cavalry in full plate armor. The trumpet signal wasn't random. Richard had established specific calls during training at Acre. 3 short blasts, followed by 1 sustained note, meant one thing only: General cavalry charge, all squadrons, execute now. Every knight from the Templars in the vanguard to the Hospitallers in the rear heard it. The sound carried across the 2-mile battlefield over the noise of drums, arrow fire, and screaming men. And every cavalry commander knew exactly what it meant, because Richard had drilled them relentlessly on this exact scenario. Here's what made the execution genuinely insane. Coordinating 200 mounted knights spread across a 2-mile front to attack simultaneously required communication technology medieval armies simply didn't have. No radios, no signal flags visible through dust and chaos. Just trumpet calls and pre-established tactical doctrine. Yet within 30 seconds of Richard's signal, 5 separate cavalry squadrons launched coordinated charges at 5 different points along Saladin's line. Think about the tactical precision that required. Squadron 1. 200 Templar knights in the vanguard charged northeast, targeting Muslim cavalry harassing the front of the column. Squadron 2. 250 French and English knights under Richard's personal command charged directly east at Saladin's center. Squadron 3. 200 knights from Brittany and Anjou targeted the right flank of Muslim forces. Squadron 4. 150 Italian and German knights hit the left center. Squadron 5. 200 Hospitaller knights, the ones who'd been under the worst assault all day, charged directly into Taqi ad-Din's 6,000 cavalry. Each squadron had been assigned targets hours earlier. Each commander knew his objective. And when the signal came, they executed with mechanical precision. This wasn't brave knights charging randomly at enemies. This was coordinated combined arms warfare executed by a medieval army. The physics of a heavy cavalry charge were devastating. A fully armored knight on a war horse. Total combined weight approximately 1,800 pounds, moving at gallop speed of 25 to 30 miles per hour, carrying a 12-foot lance, possessed kinetic energy equivalent to a modern automobile hitting a pedestrian. Now multiply that by 200 knights charging simultaneously. The impact force was measured in hundreds of tons of steel and horseflesh hitting enemy formations. But here's what made this charge uniquely devastating: the psychological factor. Saladin's cavalry had spent 6 hours attacking with impunity. They'd fired hundreds of thousands of arrows. They'd killed hundreds of Crusaders. They'd grown confident, even casual. Muslim horse archers had closed to within 40 to 50 yards of the Crusader formation, closer than they'd operated all day, because the Christians hadn't counterattacked once. Suddenly, without warning, the passive formation exploded. Infantry ranks parted. 1,200 armored knights burst through gaps in the defensive line and accelerated to full gallop in seconds. The transformation was instantaneous. The Crusader column went from defensive static formation to offensive weapon in under a minute. Muslim cavalry commanders saw the charge developing and immediately understood the danger. Horse archers tried to scatter, to retreat to safe distance. But they'd committed too close. They'd been circling at 40 to 50 yards, firing arrows, confident in their mobility. Now they had perhaps 15 seconds before 200 charging knights reached them. 15 seconds to turn their horses, accelerate to escape speed, and break contact. 15 seconds wasn't enough. The front rank of Crusader cavalry, approximately 300 knights spread across the 5 squadrons, hit Saladin's cavalry line at 3:16 p.m. The impact was catastrophic. Lances punched through light armor. War horses crashed into lighter cavalry mounts, bowling them over. Knights wielding 12-foot lances impaled Muslim cavalrymen from horseback. The sheer momentum of the charge carried the Crusaders through the first rank of Muslim cavalry like a hammer through glass. Saladin, watching from his command position, saw his carefully orchestrated assault disintegrate in seconds. The cavalry that had been systematically destroying the Crusader column suddenly found itself in close combat with armored knights. The one type of engagement Muslim horse archers couldn't win. Taqi ad-Din's 6,000 cavalry, which had been hammering the Hospitaller rear guard all day, suddenly faced 200 enraged Hospitaller knights, charging with 6 hours of accumulated fury. The Muslim cavalry broke, not in organized retreat, in panic. And when cavalry breaks and runs, infantry doctrine becomes simple: pursue and destroy. The Crusader charge, already devastating in its initial impact, transformed into a rolling wave of destruction that was about to shatter Saladin's entire army. What happened in the next 10 minutes would produce casualty ratios so lopsided they seemed impossible. But the chronicles record them clearly, and the numbers don't lie. The impact was catastrophic. Crusader knights hit the Muslim cavalry lines like a steel avalanche. A fully armored knight on a war horse at full gallop, carrying a 12-foot lance, possessed kinetic energy that could punch through almost anything. The lances hit first. Muslim cavalry in lighter armor were lifted from their saddles and thrown backward. Then came the swords, heavy blades designed to crush through armor and bone. The first minute of contact produced approximately 800 Muslim casualties. 800 men killed or wounded in 60 seconds. Think about that ratio. The Crusader cavalry numbered 1/200 knights. In the first minute of combat, 2/3 scored a kill or disabling hit. That's not combat statistics. That's a massacre. When a Crusader lance hit a Muslim cavalryman, the physics were brutal. The hardened steel point would punch through leather armor, through the rib cage, sometimes completely through the body. The impact would lift the rider from his saddle and hurl him backward into other cavalry. One lance strike could disable 2 or 3 men as bodies collided. Ibn al-Athir, writing a decade later, recorded, "The Frankish cavalry fell upon our forces like a thunderbolt. Our warriors, who moments before had been masters of the field, were thrown into confusion and panic. Men were trampled, impaled, or crushed by the weight of armored horses." The tactical mismatch was absolute. Muslim cavalry had trained for mobile warfare: fire arrows, retreat, circle, fire again. But close quarters melee against armored knights on war horses? They had no doctrine for it. Their bows were useless at 3-foot range. Their curved sabers couldn't penetrate Crusader plate, mail. Their lighter horses couldn't stand against massive war horses. By 3:18 p.m., 2 minutes after the initial charge, Saladin's entire cavalry force was in retreat. Not tactical withdrawal, full rout. Approximately 15,000 cavalry turned and fled. 6 hours of successful attacks, and within 2 minutes of facing Crusader heavy cavalry in close combat, the entire Muslim cavalry wing disintegrated. Taqi ad-Din's left wing, the 6,000 cavalry that had hammered the Hospitallers all day, broke first. The Hospitallers, charging with 6 hours of accumulated rage, hit them with apocalyptic fury. Contemporary accounts describe Hospitaller knights chasing down fleeing cavalry and cutting them down from behind. No mercy. No quarter. Just slaughter. Here's where it gets genuinely insane. The Crusader cavalry was exhausted. They'd marched for 2 weeks. They'd endured 6 hours of arrow fire. Their horses had been walking all day in desert heat. By every logical measure, they should have been too tired for extended pursuit. Instead, they chased fleeing Muslim cavalry for over 2 miles, killing without pause. Saladin watched his army dissolve. The man who'd conquered Jerusalem, who destroyed the Crusaders at Hattin, was watching 25,000 warriors run from 7,000 exhausted enemies. The Nubian infantry, positioned behind the cavalry, suddenly found themselves exposed and alone. Infantry versus heavy cavalry in open terrain has one outcome: the Nubians broke and ran. By 3:30 p.m., 14 minutes after the Crusader charge began, Saladin's entire army was in full retreat. 25,000 men fleeing east toward the hills, and Richard hadn't even committed his reserves yet. The pursuit lasted 2 hours. From 3:30 p.m. to 5:30 p.m., Crusader cavalry chased fleeing forces across 5 miles of coastal plain. This wasn't organized combat. This was slaughter. Fleeing soldiers can't defend themselves. They're running, backs exposed, completely vulnerable. Crusader knights rode them down from behind, cutting them down with swords, trampling them with war horses. Muslim losses during the pursuit, between 5,000 and 7,000 killed. Let that sink in. Saladin started the day with 25,000 troops. By sunset, he'd lost roughly 1/3 of his entire army. Not captured, not wounded and recoverable. Dead. These were elite units. Mamluk cavalry trained from childhood. Turkish horse archers with decades of experience. Nubian infantry who'd fought across North Africa and the Middle East. Professional soldiers slaughtered by Crusaders who by all logic should have been too exhausted to pursue anyone. Saladin tried to rally his forces multiple times during the retreat. At approximately 4 p.m., he positioned himself with his bodyguard at a defensive position, personally waving his yellow battle standard, calling for units to regroup. Fewer than 200 cavalry responded. The rest kept running. Saladin's bodyguard literally grabbed his horse's reins and forced him to withdraw. "My lord, the battle is lost. If you stay, you die." Saladin, the conqueror of Jerusalem, the man who'd never retreated from battle, was dragged from the field by his own guards. The Crusader pursuit reached Saladin's camp at 4:45 p.m. Saladin had abandoned it so quickly that his command tent still stood. His battle plans laid out on tables, his personal correspondence intact. The yellow Ayyubid standards were captured and later paraded through Crusader cities as trophies. Estimates suggest the Crusaders captured approximately 3,000 gold dinars, equivalent to 5 years of tax revenue from a major city. 32 battle standards were taken, each representing a different unit or commander. Losing your standard in medieval warfare was spiritually and politically devastating. By 5:30 p.m., Richard recalled his cavalry. The pursuit was over. Muslim forces had scattered completely. The battlefield fell silent, except for the groans of wounded men and cries of scavengers beginning to circle. The casualty figures tell the story of one-sided slaughter. Conservative estimates: 7,000 Muslims killed in the charge and pursuit. Some chroniclers claim it exceeded 10,000. Crusader losses? Between 700 and 1,000 total casualties for the entire day, most during the 6-hour march before the charge. 7 Muslim casualties for every Crusader casualty. During the actual charge and pursuit, 14 minutes plus 2 hours, Crusader combat losses were fewer than 100 killed. That's a 70.1 kill ratio during active combat. Modern militaries with air support, artillery, and automatic weapons rarely achieve ratios that lopsided. Richard's medieval cavalry did it with horses, lances, and swords. But Richard made a strategic decision that haunts historians. After routing Saladin's forces, he didn't pursue to total destruction. His men were exhausted. The horses nearly finished. Pushing too far risked overextension and ambush. He'd achieved his immediate objective: break Saladin's army and secure the march to Jaffa. Annihilating Saladin entirely seemed too risky. But that decision had consequences. Saladin survived. His commanders survived. Within weeks, he'd rebuild 10,000 troops. Within a month, 15,000. The war would continue another year. Some historians argue that if Richard had pursued ruthlessly, he could have ended Saladin's military power permanently and potentially recaptured Jerusalem with minimal resistance. Richard reached Jaffa by September 10th. The city surrendered without resistance. Saladin's garrison had heard about Arsuf and fled. He now controlled 60 miles of coastline with secure ports, but Jerusalem remained 60 miles inland in Muslim hands. The war ended in September 1192 in stalemate, exactly the outcome aggressive pursuit at Arsuf might have prevented. Despite this, Arsuf fundamentally altered the Third Crusade. Saladin's aura of invincibility shattered. Richard's reputation became legendary, not just a brave warrior, but a tactical genius who'd solved the problem of fighting Muslim cavalry in open terrain. Within 2 weeks, Saladin received messages from 3 major emirs questioning his strategy. His own brother suggested negotiations might be preferable to continued warfare. His inner circle was losing confidence. Baha ad-Din ibn Shaddad recorded that Saladin barely slept for 3 days following the battle, trying to understand how Richard's exhausted army had destroyed his numerical superiority. Muslim military doctrine had no framework for what happened. The answer was discipline. Richard had imposed Roman legion-level coordination on a medieval army, unprecedented in the Crusades. The Battle of Arsuf became a case study in medieval military doctrine for 2 centuries. Richard's defensive marching formation was copied by commanders across Europe. Infantry as a mobile shield wall for cavalry, strict discipline under missile fire, timing a cavalry charge for maximum impact. These concepts became fundamental to European military thinking. For Saladin, Arsuf was the beginning of the end. He never faced Richard in open battle again. When Richard departed the Holy Land in October 1192, Saladin reportedly told his advisors, "Thank God the lion is leaving." 5 months later, Saladin was dead. He was only 55. 13 months after Arsuf, 4 months after Richard's departure, his health collapsed. Stress, exhaustion, the psychological burden. These factors don't appear in medieval medical diagnoses, but they kill commanders just as surely as disease. Here's the final truth about Arsuf. It proved that wars aren't won by numbers alone. Discipline matters, training matters, leadership matters, timing matters. Richard had all 4, and on September 7th, 1191, he deployed them perfectly. 7,000 against 25,000. 6 hours of torture followed by 14 minutes of devastation. A 7.1 casualty ratio in favor of the smaller force. Tactical perfection executed under impossible conditions. September 7th, 1191. 7,000 men faced annihilation and chose to stand. They absorbed punishment that should have broken them. And when their king gave the signal, they struck back with such devastating fury that they shattered an empire's finest army and changed the course of medieval warfare forever. That's not just a battle. That's a legend, and legends never die.